On his way out of a luxury hotel, a busy billionaire accidentally drops his expensive wallet completely unaware. But when a homeless black girl returns it before he even realizes it's missing, something shifts. He sees a frail, starving child fighting for her life in a world that has long ignored her. What happens when two lives from opposite worlds collide by chance? Before diving into the story, leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think the city of New York hummed with. Its usual chaotic rhythm, a mixture of honking horns, hurried footsteps, and the distant rumble of an approaching subway train. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the glass facades of towering skyscrapers, reflecting off the polished surfaces of high-end cars idling along the curb. The scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor mixed with the sharp tang of exhaust fumes, creating a scent that was uniquely, unmistakably urban, emerging from the grand entrance of the Lexington Hotel, a luxurious five-star establishment known for hosting the elite. David Lancaster, 45 years old, a billionaire whose face was often seen on the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, stepped onto the sidewalk. His tailored charcoal gray suit fit him perfectly, a symbol of the meticulous precision with which he lived his life. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back neatly, and the subtle glint of a gold Rolex peeked out from beneath his sleeve as he reached into his inner jacket pocket. As David retrieved his sleek black leather wallet, checking the contents with his usual habit of efficiency, his phone vibrated in his other hand. He barely spared the notification a glance. It was likely another reminder from his secretary about his upcoming shareholder meeting downtown. Without thinking, he slid the phone back into his pocket, not noticing as the movement caused the wallet to slip from his grasp. It landed with a soft, almost imperceptible thud onto the smooth pavement below, blending seamlessly with the polished stone sidewalk. David continued walking toward his awaiting limousine, a sleek, jet-black Rolls-Royce Phantom that gleamed under the fading sunlight. His longtime driver and personal assistant, Robert Miller, stood beside the open rear door, his usual composed demeanor in place. "Everything on schedule, sir?" Robert asked, his deep voice carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years anticipating his employer's needs. "As always," David replied, smoothing down his jacket as he prepared to slide into the plush leather interior. Across the street, amidst the blur of pedestrians, Amina Johnson, 10 years old, sat on the cold, cracked concrete near the entrance of a subway station, her back pressed against the rough surface of a rusted metal railing. She had positioned herself in a spot just out of the way of foot traffic, where people wouldn't trip over her, but where she was still visible enough for anyone to drop a coin into the small paper cup in front of her. She had been there for hours, watching hundreds of polished shoes and designer heels pass by, not slowing, not sparing a second glance at the little girl huddled in oversized clothes that barely clung to her frail frame. Her stomach rumbled, a dull, persistent ache she had grown used to, but the real discomfort came from the deep itch in her skin, the persistent reminder of the illness eating away at her body. The hoodie she wore, once a faded shade of pink, but now smudged with dirt, barely concealed the telltale signs of her condition. Her bald head, a result of the illness, rather than a deliberate choice, gleamed slightly under the streetlights. Some people stared for a moment too long, their expressions unreadable. Pity, curiosity, discomfort, but no one ever stopped. Amina had long learned that people didn't like being reminded of things that made them uncomfortable. It was easier to ignore suffering than to acknowledge it. She had just begun to lose hope of collecting enough money for even a single meal when she noticed something unusual, a black wallet, clearly expensive, lying unattended on the sidewalk. She blinked, her gaze darting from the wallet to the nun who had unknowingly dropped it, a sharply dressed white man stepping into a limousine. Her heart pounded as she quickly scrambled to her feet, grabbing the wallet with nimble fingers. Amina had seen people drop things before, but she had never dared to intervene. Most would assume the worst of a street kid like her, but this time, this was different. She could see Robert closing the car door, about to seal the man inside. "Mr. Wait," she called, her voice barely carrying over the noise of the city. When they didn't hear her, she ran, her worn-out sneakers slapped against the pavement as she weaved through pedestrians who barely noticed her presence. Her lungs burned, but she pushed forward, her eyes locked on the limousine, knowing she only had seconds before the car pulled away. Just as Robert placed his hand on the door handle to shut it completely, Amina lunged forward, reaching out and grabbing the edge of David's suit sleeve before immediately letting go. Realizing too late how improper that was, David turned sharply, mild irritation flashing in his piercing blue eyes. Robert instinctively took a step forward, placing himself between his employer and the ragged-looking child who had just dared to touch a billionaire's tailored sleeve, but before Robert could say anything, Amina thrust them. Wallet forward, her breathing heavy, but determined. "You dropped this," she said simply, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled from exhaustion. For a moment, there was silence. David stared down at the wallet, then back at Amina, assessing her. Most people would have pocketed, especially someone who clearly needed money as much as she did. A brief flicker of something surprise crossed his features. Finally, he reached out and took the wallet from her small hands, his fingers brushing against hers for just a second. "Thank you," he said, his voice measured, as if the words felt unfamiliar in this context. Amina gave him a small nod, as if she hadn't expected anything more. She turned, already stepping back onto the curb, ready to return to her spot near the subway station. David had already begun to shift toward the car when a voice, sharp and full of irritation, cut through the air. "You again?" A middle-aged man in a greasy apron, the logo of a nearby convenience store embroidered across his chest, stomped toward them. His face was twisted in frustration. His eyes locked onto Amina, as if she were a stray animal that had wandered too close. "I told you to stop hanging around my store. You're scaring off my customers." Amina froze, shoulders tensing, her head instinctively dipping forward like she was bracing for impact. David, still standing by the open limousine door, slowly turned to the man, his expression unreadable. "Is she causing trouble?" he asked, his tone deceptively neutral. The store owner hesitated for half a second, clearly recognizing the high-profile businessman he had just snapped at. But his frustration outweighed his caution. "She doesn't steal anything, but she touches everything, lingers around like she's waiting for the right moment to snatch something. It's bad for business." David's eyebrow lifted, the slight gesture exuding the confidence of a man who wasn't used to being challenged. "So she hasn't actually done anything wrong?" The man flushed, shifting on his feet. "Well, no," but David studied him for a long moment before letting out a small, almost amused breath. He glanced back at Amina, who still stood stiffly, her hands clenched into small fists at her sides. "Interesting," he murmured without another word. He turned, stepping into the limousine. Robert shut the door, the outside world muffling instantly. As the car pulled away, David didn't immediately reach for his phone or his meeting notes. Instead, he leaned slightly toward the tinted window, watching Amina disappear into the crowd. Something about the encounter lingered in his mind. A child with nothing had just returned a wallet worth more than what she'd probably see in a year. And for some reason, he found himself noticing her in a way he never had before. Inside the climate-controlled silence of the limousine, David Lancaster sat with one leg crossed over the other, fingers idly tapping against the smooth leather of his wallet. The exchange with the girl played in his mind like a scene from a film, brief but unshakable, leaving behind an impression that refused to fade. He had encountered countless people in his life, from billionaires in tailored suits to politicians hungry for influence, yet few had left him with a feeling quite like this. A street kid, homeless and clearly struggling, had not only returned his wallet, but had done so without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. That in itself was rare. Robert Miller, his driver and longtime assistant, had been with him long enough to sense the shift in his mood. From the rearview mirror, he observed the subtle furrow in David's brow, the window, watching the crowded sidewalks blur past. After a moment, he exhaled through his nose, a thoughtful sound rather than a dismissal. "She didn't even think twice," he murmured, more to himself than to Robert. "Just ran after me like it was the only option." Robert nodded slightly. "Some people, even when they have nothing, still choose to do the right thing." David considered that, his fingers still absently brushing against the edge of his wallet. His mind flickered back to the store owner's words, the way the man had spoken about her, as if her mere existence outside his store was a crime. It wasn't the first time David had seen that kind of dismissive hostility. People feared what made them uncomfortable, what reminded them that life wasn't as balanced as they liked to believe. He shifted slightly in his seat. "Slow down, Robert." Robert, though slightly surprised, obeyed without question, easing his grip on the steering wheel as the limousine's speed decreased. "Something wrong?" Sir David scanned the streets as the car rolled forward at a more deliberate pace, his sharp gaze flicking through the sea of pedestrians. "See if you can spot her." Robert's brow lifted slightly, but he didn't question the request. Instead, he adjusted the rearview mirror, glancing out at the passing sidewalks. They both searched, eyes moving through the faces of hurried professionals, tourists clutching shopping bags, street vendors shouting over the city noise. Then there, a familiar small figure hunched against the cold brick wall of another convenience store. A block down, the girl. She was sitting on the sidewalk, her knees pulled close to her chest, her paper cup still in front of Her, though it remained nearly empty, unlike before, her head wasn't turned toward passing pedestrians in silent hope. Instead, she was staring at her. Hands, fingers tracing over her thin wrists, as if trying to warm them. David observed her for a moment, his expression unreadable pullover. He instructed Robert hesitated only for a fraction of a second, before easing the car toward the curb, bringing the limousine to a smooth stop, just ahead of where the girl sat. David reached for the door handle, pausing only briefly, before stepping out onto the pavement. His polished Oxford shoes met the cracked concrete with a quiet but definitive sound, one that made the girl's head snap up. She recognized him immediately. Her dark eyes widened slightly, though whether in surprise, confusion, or caution, David couldn't tell. He crouched to her level, taking care to keep his movements measured, unthreatening. The city noise can annoyed them, but in that moment, the world seemed to shrink between just the two of them. "Hello again," he said, his tone calm but intent. The girl's gaze flickered to the limousine behind him, then back to David, her instincts screaming that this was out of the ordinary. Men like him, men in expensive suits stepping out of cars worth more than a lifetime of meals, didn't come back. They didn't stop twice. "Did I forget something?" she asked carefully. David almost smiled at that. The way her immediate thought was that she must made a mistake, that the only reason he'd returned was because he needed something from her. "No," he said simply, "but I think I might have." Her brows knitted, confusion flickering across her features. David didn't immediately elaborate. Instead, he reached into his wallet, the same one she'd returned to him just minutes ago. He withdrew several crisp $100 bills and placed them in the cup in front of her. The girl froze, staring at the money as if she wasn't sure whether it was real. She swallowed. I don't need. It's not charity," David interrupted smoothly. "It's for a meal, maybe something warm to wear." She hesitated, clearly fighting some internal battle. Eventually, she looked away, her fingers curling slightly around the edge of the cup. "Thank you," she murmured, though the words sounded both grateful and wary. David studied her for a moment longer, then in a voice quieter, more deliberate, he asked, "What's your name?" The girl blinked, surprised by the question. For a moment, she hesitated, as if debating whether to answer. "Amina," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded slightly, committing the name to memory. "Amina," he repeated, testing the sound of it. Then, with quiet intent, he asked, "What do you really need?" Her head snapped back up, her eyes locking onto his. David hadn't meant for the question to carry weight, but somehow it did, because for the first time since they had crossed paths, Amina's carefully constructed walls wavered. She was still a child, still young enough to wish for things, but old enough to understand how cruel the world could be. Her small hands clenched around the fabric of her hoodie, as if holding herself together. "I need help," she whispered. There was something raw about the way she said it, something that made David sit back slightly, something that told him this wasn't about the money before.